200 Years Together. Russo-Jewish History by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Volume 1. The Jews Before the Revolution. Chapter 1. Before the 19th Century. From the Beginnings in Khazaria. In this book, the presence of the Jews in Russia prior to 1772 will not be discussed in detail. However, for a few pages, we want to remember the older epochs. One could begin that the paths of Russians and Jews first crossed in the wars between the Kiev Rus and the Khazars, but that isn't completely right, since only the upper class of the Khazars were of Hebraic descent, the tribe itself being a branch of the Turks that had accepted the Jewish faith. If one follows the presentation of J.D. Beruzcu's respected Jewish author of the mid-20th century, a certain part of the Jews from Persia moved across the Derbent Pass to the lower Volga, where Atil, west coast of the Caspian Volga Delta, the capital city of the Khazarian Khanate, rose up starting 724 AD. The tribal princes of the Turkish Khazars, at the time still idol worshippers, did not want to accept either the Muslim faith, lest they should be subordinated to the Caliph of Baghdad, nor to Christianity, lest they come under vassalage to the Byzantine emperor. And so the clan went over to the Jewish faith in 732. But there was also a Jewish colony in the Bosporan Kingdom on the Taman Peninsula at the east end of the Crimea, separating the Black Sea from the Sea of Azov, to which Hadrian had Jewish captives brought in 137 after the victory over Bar Kokhba. Later, a Jewish settlement sustained itself without break under the Goth and Huns in the Crimea, especially Kaffa, Theodosia, remained Jewish. In 933, Prince Igor, 912 to 945, Grand Prince of Kiev, successor of Oleg, regent after death of Ryurik, founder of the Kiev Kingdom in 862, temporarily possessed Kerch, and his son, Sviatoslav, Grand Prince 960 to 972, wrested the Don region from the Khazars. The Kiev Rus already ruled the entire Volga region, including Atil in 909, and Russian ships appeared at Samander, south of Atil on the west coast of the Caspian. Descendants of the Khazars were the Kumyks in the Caucasus. In the Crimea, on the other hand, they combined with the Polovtsi, nomadic Turkish branch from Central Asia in the northern Black Sea area and the Caucasus since the 10th century, called Kuban or Kuman by Western historians. See the second map below, to form the Crimean Tartars. But the Karaim, a Jewish sect that does not follow the Talmud, and Jewish residents of the Crimean did not go over to the Muslim faith. The Khazars were finally conquered much later by Tamerlane or Timur, the 14th century conqueror. A few researchers, however, hypothesize, exact proof is absent, that the Hebrews had wandered to some extent through the South Russian region in west and northwest direction. Thus, the Orientalist and Semitist Abraham Harkavi, for example, writes that the Jewish congregation in the future Russia emerged from Jews that came from the Black Sea coast and from the Caucasus, where their ancestors had lived since the Assyrian and Babylonian captivity. J.D. Beruzcu's also leans to this perspective. Another opinion suggests it is the remnant of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. This migration presumably ended after the conquest of Tamatarakan's east shore of the Kerch Straits, overlooking the east end of the Crimean Peninsula, the eastern flank of the old Bosporan Kingdom, 1097, by the Polovtsi. According to Harkavi's opinion, the vernacular of these Jews, at least since the 9th century, was Slavic, and only in the 17th century, when the Ukrainian Jews fled the pogroms of Chmelnytsky. Bogdan Chmelnytsky, Ukrainian Cossack, 1593 to 1657, led the successful Cossack rebellion against Poland with help from the Crimean Tatars. Did Yiddish become the language of Jews in Poland? In various manners, the Jews also came to Kiev and settled there. Already under Igor, the lower part of the city was called Kosary. In 933, Igor brought Jews that had been taken captive in Kerch. Then, in 965, Jews taken captive in the Crimea were brought there. In 969, Kosarin from Atil and Samander. In 989, from Cherson, and in 1017, from Temutarakan. In Kiev, Western Jews also emerged, in connection with the caravan traffic from west to east, and starting at the end of the 11th century, maybe on account of the persecution in Europe during the First Crusade. Later researchers confirmed likewise that in the 11th century, the Jewish element in Kiev is to be derived from the Khazars. Still earlier, at the turn of the 10th century, the presence of a Khazar force and a Khazar garrison was chronicled in Kiev, and already in the first half of the 11th century, the Jewish Khazar element in Kiev played a significant role. In the 9th and 10th century, Kiev was multinational and tolerant. At the end of the 10th century, in the time when Prince Vladimir I. Svatoslavich, 980-1015, the Saint, Grand Prince of Kiev, was choosing a new faith for the Russians, there were not a few Jews in Kiev, and among them were found educated men that suggested taking on the Jewish faith. The choice fell out otherwise than it had 250 years earlier in the Khazar kingdom. Karamsin, 1766 to 1826, Russian historian, relates it like this. After he, Vladimir, had listened to the Jews, he asked where their homeland was. In Jerusalem, answered the delegates. But God has chased us in his anger and sent us into a foreign land. And you, whom God has punished, dare to teach others? Said Vladimir. We do not want to lose our fatherland like you have. After the Christianization of the Rus, according to Bruskas, a portion of the Khazar Jews in Kiev also went over to Christianity, and afterwards, in Novgorod, perhaps one of them, Luka Zidyata, was even one of the first bishops and spiritual writers. Christianity and Judaism, being side by side in Kiev, inevitably led to the learned zealously contrasting them. From that emerged the work significant to Russian literature, Sermon on Law and Grace, by Hilarion, first Russian metropolitan, middle 11th century, which contributed to the settling of a Christian consciousness for the Russians that lasted for centuries. The polemic here is as fresh and lively as in the letters of the apostles. In any case, it was the first century of Christianity in Russia. For the Russian neophytes of that time, the Jews were interesting, especially in connection to their religious presentation, and even in Kiev there were opportunities for contact with them. The interest was greater than later in the 18th century, when they again were physically close. Then, for more than a century, the Jews took part in the expanded commerce of Kiev. In the new city wall, completed in 1037, there was the Jews' Gate, which closed in the Jewish quarter. The Kiev Jews were not subjected to any limitations, and the princes did not handle themselves hostilely, but rather indeed vouchsafed to protect them, especially Svyatopolk Izyaslávich, Prince of Novgorod, from 1078 to 1087, Grand Prince of Kiev from 1093 to 1113. Since the trade and enterprising spirit of the Jews brought the princes financial advantage. In 1113, Vladimir, later called Monomach, out of qualms of conscience, even after the death of Sviatopolk, hesitated to ascend the Kiev throne prior to one of the Slavatoslaviches, and exploiting the anarchy, rioters plundered the house of the regimental commander Putiata and all Jews that stood under the special protection of the greedy Sviatopolk in the capital city. One reason for the Kiev revolt was apparently the usury of the Jews, probably exploiting the shortage of money of the time. They enslaved the debtors with exorbitant interest. For example, there are indications in the Statute of Vladimir Monomakh that Kiev moneylenders received interest up to 50% per annum. In Karamsin, therein appeals to the chronicles and an extrapolation by Basil Tatichev, 1686 to 1750, student of Peter the Great, first Russian historian. In Tatishchev, we find, moreover, afterwards, they clubbed down many Jews and plundered their houses, because they had brought about many sicknesses to Christians, and commerce with them had brought about great damage. Many of them, who had gathered in their synagogue seeking protection, defended themselves as well as they could, and redeemed time until Vladimir would arrive. But when he had come, the Kievites pleaded with him for retribution toward the Jews, because they had taken all the trades from Christians, and under Sviatopolk had had much freedom and power. They also brought many over to their faith. According to M. N. Pokrovsky, the Kiev pogrom of 1113 had social and not national character. However, the leaning of this class-conscious historian toward social interpretations is well known. After he ascended to the Kiev throne, Vladimir answered the complaints. Since many Jews everywhere have received access to the various princely courts and have migrated there, it is not appropriate for me, without the advice of the princes, and moreover contrary to rights, to permit killing and plundering them. Hence, I will without delay call the princes to assemble to give counsel. In the council, a law limiting the interest was established, which Vladimir attached to Yaroslav's statute. Karamsin reports, appealing to Tatashev, that Vladimir banned all Jews upon the conclusion of the council, and from that time forth there were none left in our fatherland. But at the same time, he qualifies, in the Chronicles, in contrast, it says that in 1124 the Jews in Kiev died in a great fire. Consequently, they had not been banned. Bruscus explains that it was a whole quarter in the best part of the city, at the Jews' gate, next to the Golden Gate. At least one Jew enjoyed the trust of Andrei Bogolyubsky, or Andrei Bogolyubsky, in Vladimir. Among the confidants of Andrei was a certain Ephraim Moisich, who patronymic Moisich, or Moisevich, indicates his Jewish derivation, and who, according to the words of the Chronicle, was among the instigators of the treason by which Andrei was murdered. However, there is also a notation that says that under Andrei Bogolyubsky, many Bulgarians and Jews from the Volga territory came and had themselves baptized, and that after the murder of Andrei, his son Georgy fled to a Jewish prince in Dagestan. In any case, the information on the Jews in the time of the Suzdal Rus is scanty, as their numbers were obviously small. The Jewish Encyclopedia notes that in the Russian heroic songs, the Bailinin, the Jewish Caesar, e.g. the warrior Shidowin, in the old Bailina about Ilya and Dobrynas, is a favorite general moniker for an enemy of the Christian faith. At the same time, it could also be a trace of memories of the struggle against the Khazars. Here, the religious basis of this hostility and exclusion is made clear. On this basis, the Jews were not permitted to settle in the Muscovy Rus. The invasion of the Tatars portended the end of the lively commerce of the Kiev Rus, and many Jews apparently went to Poland. Also, the Jewish colonization into Volhynia and Galicia continued, where they had scarcely suffered from the Tatar invasion. The encyclopedia explains, during the invasion of the Tatars, 1239, which destroyed Kiev, the Jews also suffered, but in the second half of the 13th century, they were invited by the Grand Princes to resettle in Kiev, which found itself under the domination of the Tatars. On account of these special rights, which were also granted the Jews and other possessions of the Tatars, envy was stirred up in the town residents against the Kiev Jews. Similar happened not only in Kiev, but also in the cities of North Russia, which, under the Tatar rule, were accessible for many merchants, Khorasan or Khiva, who were long since experienced in trade and the tricks of profit-seeking. These people bought from the Tatars the principality's right to levy tribute. They demanded excessive interest from poor people, and in case of their failure to pay, declared the debtors to be their slaves and took away their freedom. The residents of Vladimir, Suzdal, and Rostov finally lost their patience and rose up together at the pealing of the bells against these usurers. A few were killed and the rest chased off. A punitive expedition of the Khan against the mutineers was threatened, which however was hindered via the mediation of Alexander Nevsky. In the documents of the 15th century, Kievite Jewish tax leasers are mentioned, who possessed a significant fortune. The Judaizing heresy. A migration of Jews from Poland to the east, including White Russia, Belarus, should also be noted in the 15th century. There were lessers of tolls and other assessments in Minsk, Polotsk, and Smolensk, although no settled congregations were formed there. After the short-lived banishment of the Jews from Lithuania, 1496, the eastward movement went forth with particular energy at the beginning of the 16th century. The number of Jews that migrated into the Muscovy Rus was insignificant, although influential Jews at that time had no difficulties going to Moscow. Toward the end of the 15th century, in the very center of the spiritual and administrative power of the Rus, a change took place, though barely noticed, could have drawn an ominous unrest in its wake, and had far-reaching consequences in the spiritual domain. It had to do with the Judaizing heresy. Saint Joseph of Volokolmosk, 1439 to 1515, who resisted it, observed, "Since the time of Olga and Vladimir, the God-fearing Russian world has never experienced such a seduction." According to Kramsin, it began thus. The Jew Zechariah, who in 1470 had arrived in Novgorod from Kiev, figured out how to lead astray two spirituals, Dionys and Alexei. He assured them that only the law of Moses was divine. The history of the Redeemer was invented. The Messiah was not yet born. One should not pray to icons, etc. Thus began the Judaizing heresy. Sergei Solovyoy, 1820 to 79, great Russian historian, explains on this that Zechariah accomplished it with the aid of 5 accomplices who were also Jewish, and that this heresy obviously was a mixture of Judaism and Christian rationalism that denied the mystery of the Holy Trinity and the divinity of Jesus Christ. The Orthodox priest Alexei called himself Abraham. His wife he called Sarah, and along with Dionys corrupted many spirituals and lay. But it is hard to understand how Zechariah was able to easily increase the number of his Novgorod pupils, since his wisdom consisted entirely and only in the rejection of Christianity and the glorification of Judaism. Probably Zechariah seduced the Russians with the Jewish Kabbalah, a teaching that captured curious ignoramuses, and in the 15th century was well known, when many educated men sought in it the solution to all important riddles of the human spirit. The Kabbalists extolled themselves. They were able to discern all secrets of nature, explain dreams, prophesy the future, and conjure spirits. J. Gessen, a Jewish historian of the 20th century, represents in contrast the opinion. It is certain that Jews participated neither in the introduction of the heresy nor its spread, but with no indication of its sources. The Encyclopedia of Brockhaus and Ephron, 1890 to 1906, Russian equivalent to the 1911 Britannica, explains, apparently the genuinely Jewish element played no outstanding role, limiting its contribution to a few rituals. And the Jewish Encyclopedia, which appeared about the same time, writes on the other hand, today, since the publication of the Psalter of the Judaizers and other memorials, the contested question of the Jewish influence on the sects must be seen as settled in a positive sense. The Novgorod heretics respected an orderly exterior, appeared to fast humbly and zealously, fulfilled all the duties of piety. They made themselves noticed by the people and contributed to the rapid spreading of the heresy. When after the fall of Novgorod, Ivan Vasilievich III, 1440 to 1505, English name would be John son of Basil, Grand Prince of Moscow, united the greater Russian territory under Moscow's rule, visited the city. He was impressed by their piety and took both of the first heretics, Alexei and Dionys, to Moscow in 1480 and promoted them as high priests in the Assumption of Mary and the Archangel cathedrals of the Kremlin. With them also the schism was brought over, the roots of which remained in Novgorod. Alexei found special favor with the ruler and had free access to him, and with his secret teaching, enticed not only several high spirituals and officials, but moved the Grand Prince to appoint the Archimandrite, or the head of abbot in the Eastern Orthodoxy, Zosima, as a metropolitan, that is, the head of the entire Russian Church. A man from the very circle of those he had enticed with the heresy. In addition, he enticed Helena to the heresy, daughter-in-law of the Grand Prince, widow of Ivan the Younger, and mother to the heir to the throne, the blessed nephew, Dmitri. The rapid success of this movement, and the ease with which it spread, is astonishing. This is obviously to be explained through mutual interests. When the Psalter of the Judaizing and other works, which could mislead the inexperienced Russian reader and were sometimes unambiguously anti-Christian, were translated from Hebrew to Russian, one could have assumed that only Jews and Judaism would have been interested in them. But also, the Russian reader was interested in the translations of Jewish religious texts. And this explains the success which the propaganda of the Judaizing had in various classes of society. The sharpness and liveliness of this contact reminds of that which had emerged in Kiev in the 11th century. The Novgorod Archbishop Gennady uncovered the heresy in 1487, sent irrefutable proofs of it to Moscow, hunted the heresy out and unmasked it, until in 1490 a church council assembled to discuss the matter under leadership of the just promoted metropolitan Zosima. With horror, they heard the complaint of Gennady that these apostates insult Christ and the Mother of God, spit on the cross, call the icons idolatrous images, bite on them with their teeth, and throw them into impure places, believe in neither the kingdom of heaven nor the resurrection of the dead, and entice the weak, while remaining quiet in the presence of zealous Christians. From the judgment of the council, it is apparent that the Judaizers did not recognize Jesus Christ as the Son of God, that they taught the Messiah is not yet appeared, that they observe the Old Testament Sabbath day rather than the Christian Sunday. It was suggested to the council to execute the heretics, but, in accordance with the will of Ivan III, they were sentenced instead to imprisonment, and the heresy was anathematized. In view of the coarseness of the century and the seriousness of the moral corruption, such a punishment was extraordinarily mild. The historians unanimously explain this hesitation of Ivan in that the heresy had already spread widely under his own roof, and was practically by well-known, influential people, among whom was Fyodor Kurizin, Ivan's plenipotentiary secretary, so to speak, the foreign minister, famous on account of his education and his capabilities. The noteworthy liberalism of Moscow flowed from the temporary dictator of the heart, F. Kurizin. The magic of his secret salon was enjoyed even by the Grand Prince and his daughter-in-law. The heresy was by no means in abatement, but rather prospered magnificently and spread itself out. At the Moscow court, astrology and magic, along with the attractions of a pseudo-scientific revision of the entire medieval worldview, were solidly propagated, which was free thinking, the appeal of enlightenment, and the power of fashion. The Jewish Encyclopedia sets forth, moreover, that Ivan III, out of political motivations, did not stand against the heresy. With Zechariah's help, he hoped to strengthen his influence in Lithuania. And besides that, he wanted to secure the favor of influential Jews from the Crimea, of the princes and rulers of Taman Peninsula, Zacharias the Gisolfi, and of the Jew Chosi Kokos, a confidant of the Khan Mengli Giray or Girai. After the Council of 1490, Sosima continued to sponsor a secret society for several years, but then was himself discovered, and in 1494 the Grand Prince commanded him to depose himself without process and to withdraw into a cloister, without throwing up dust, and to all appearances willingly. The heresy, however, did not abate. For a time, 1498, its votaries in Moscow seized almost all the power, and their charge, Dmitri, the son of the princess Helena, was coronated as Caesar. Soon, Ivan III reconciled himself with his wife Sophia Palaiologos, and in 1502 his son Vasily inherited the throne. Kurizin by this time was dead. Of the heretics, after the Council of 1504, one part was burned, a second part thrown into prison, and a third fled to Lithuania, where they formally adopted the Mosaic faith. It must be added that the overcoming of the Judaizing heresy gave the spiritual life of the Muscovy Rus at the turn of the 16th century a new impetus, and contributed to recognizing the need for spiritual education, for schools for the spiritual, and the name of Archbishop Gennady is associated with the collecting and publication of the first Church Slavic Bible, of which there had not to that point been a consolidation text corpus in the Christian East. The printing press was invented, and after 80 years, this Gennady Bible was printed in Ostrog in 1580 to 1582. As the first Church Slavic Bible, with its appearance, it took over the entire Orthodox East. Even Academy member S. F. Platonov gives a generalizing judgment about the phenomenon. The movement of Judaizing no doubt contained elements of the West European rationalism. The heresy was condemned. Its advocates had to suffer, but the attitude of critique and skepticism produced by them over against dogma and church order remained. Today's Jewish Encyclopedia remembers the thesis that an extremely negative posture towards Judaism and the Jews was unknown in the Muscovy Rus up to the beginning of the 16th century, and derives it from this struggle against the Judaizers. Judging by the spiritual and civil measures of the circumstances, that is thoroughly probable. J. Gessen, however, contends it is significant that such a specific coloring of the heresy as Judaizing did not lessen the success of the sects and in no way led to the development of a hostile stance toward the Jews. You're in. No, you're out. Okay, you're in. Judging by its stable manner of life, it was in neighboring Poland that the biggest Jewish community emerged, expanded, and became strong from the 13th to the 18th century. It formed the basis of the future Russian Jewry, which became the most important part of world Jewry until the 20th century. Starting in the 16th century, a significant number of Polish and Czech Jews emigrated into the Ukraine, White Russia, and Lithuania. In the 15th century, Jewish merchants traveled still unhindered from the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom to Moscow, but that changed under Ivan IV the Terrible. Jewish merchants were forbidden entry. When in 1550 the Polish king Sigismund August desired to permit them free entry into Russia, this was denied by Ivan with these words: "We absolutely do not permit the entry of the Jew into my lands, because we do not wish to see evil in our lands, but rather may God grant that the people in my land may have rest from that irritation, and you, our brother, should not write us on account of the Jews again." For they had alienated the Russians from Christianity, brought poisonous plants into our lands, and done much evil to our lands. According to a legend, Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible, upon the annexation of Polotsk in 1563, ordered all Jews to be baptized in response to complaints of Russian residents against evil things and bullying by Jews, leasers, and others empowered by Polish magnates. Those that refused, apparently about 300 persons, are supposed to have been drowned in his presence in the Dvina. But careful historians, as E.G. J.I. Gessen, do not confirm this version even in moderated form, and do not mention it once. Instead of that, Gessen writes that under the false Dmitri I, 1605 to 1606, both Jews and other foreigners in relatively large number were baptized in Moscow. The story goes, according to In the Time of Troubles by Sergei Ivanov, regarding the 15-year period of 1598 to 1613, of confusion following the failed Rurik dynasty, that the false Dmitri II, the thief of Tushino, was born a Jew. The sources give contradictory information regarding the ancestry of the thief of Tushino. Solzhenitsyn relates that after the time of troubles, Jews, like Polish-Lithuanian folk in general, had restricted rights in Russia. There was prohibition of peddling in Moscow, or to travel beyond Moscow at all, but ordinances were contradictory. Mikhail Fyodorovich, Michael, son of Theodore, 1613, became first Romanov chosen as Caesar, did not pursue a principal policy against the Jews. Alexis Mikhailovich, Alexis, son of Michael, Caesar, 1645. No sign of discrimination against Jews in the law book. Free access granted to all cities, including Moscow. During the seizure of Lithuania, as well as later wars, treatment of Jews in captivity was not worse than other foreigners. After the Treaty of Andrusovo in 1667, in which Smolensk and Kiev and the whole eastern bank of the Dnieper River remained Russian, Jews were invited to stay, and many did. Some converted to Christianity, and some of these became heads of noble families. A small number of baptized migrated to a Cossack village on the Don, and a dozen Cossack families descended from them. Samuel Collins, an Englishman residing in Moscow at the time, related that, in a short time, the Jews have in remarkable way spread throughout the city and court, helped by the mediation of a Jewish surgeon. Fyodor III, son of Alexis, Theodore 1676 Caesar, Jews not to be assessed toll on entry to Moscow, because they are not allowed in. whether with or without wares, but the practice did not correspond to the theory. In the first year of Peter the Great, doors were opened to talented foreigners, but not Jews on account of their being rogues and deceivers. Yet there is no evidence of limitations imposed on them, nor special laws. Indeed, Jews were found close to the emperor. Vice-Chancellor Baron Peter Shafarov, close confidant Abram Veselovsky, later accused of thieving, his brother Isaac Veselovsky, Anton de Vieira, General Police Master of Petersburg, Vivier, head of secret police, and others. To A. Veselovsky, Peter wrote that what matters is competence and decency, not baptism or circumcision. Jewish houses in Germany inquired whether Russia would guarantee their commerce with Persia, but never received it. At the start of the 18th century, there was increased Jewish trade activity in Little Russia, or, as we know it, Ukraine. A year before Russian merchants got the right, Hetman, Ukrainian chief, Skoropadsky, gave orders several times for their expulsion, but this was not obeyed, and Jewish presence actually increased. Catherine I decreed removal of Jews from Ukraine and Russian cities, but only lasted 1 year. Peter II, the Tsar in 1727, permitted Jews into Little Russia, first as temporary visits on the ground of their usefulness for trade, then more and more reasons found to make it permanent. Under Anna, the 1730 Caesarina, this right was extended to Smolensk and Slobodsky. In 1734, permission was given to distill brandy, and in 1736 it was permitted to import vodka from Poland into Russia. Baltic financier Levi Lippmann probably bailed out the future Caesarina Anna financially while she was living in Courland. Later, he achieved a high rank in her court in financial administration and received various monopoly rights. Elizabeth, 1741 Caesarina, however, issued a ukase, imperial Russian decree, 1 year after taking the throne, in December of 1742. Jews are forbidden to live anywhere in our realm. Now it has been made known to us that these Jews still find themselves in our realm, and under various pretexts, especially in Little Russia, they prolong their stay, which is in no way beneficial. But as we must expect only great injuries to our loyal subjects from such haters of the name of our Savior Jesus Christ, we order all Jews, male and female, along with their entire possession, to be sent without delay from our realm over the border, and in the future not allowed back in, unless it should be that one of them should confess our Greek Christian religion. This was the same religious intolerance that shook Europe for centuries. The way of thinking of that time was not unique in any special Russian way, nor was it an exclusively Jew-hostile attitude. Among Christians, the religious intolerance was not practiced with any less cruelty. Thus, the old believers, i.e., men of the same Orthodox faith, were persecuted with fire and sword. This ukase of Elizabeth was made known throughout the realm, but immediately attempts were made to move the ruler to relent. The military chancellor reported to the Senate from the Ukraine that already 140 people were evicted, but that the prohibition for Jews to bring goods in would lead to a reduction in state income. The Senate reported to the Caesarina that trade had suffered great damage in Little Russia, as well as the Baltic provinces, by the ukase of the previous year not to allow Jews into the realm, and also the state burse would suffer by the reduction of income from tolls. The Caesarina answered with the resolution, "I desire no profit from the enemies of Christ." Solzhenitsyn discusses contradictory sources as to the number of Jews that were actually evicted, ranging from almost none to 35,000, the latter figure having questionable origins. strong resistance to the edict by Jews, land proprietors, and the state apparatuses meant it was enforced almost as little as previous attempts had been. Catherine II, Caesarin 1762, in consequence of a coup, and also being a neophyte to orthodoxy herself, was unwilling to start her reign opening things up for the Jews, though the Senate advised for it. Jews pressed for it and had spokesmen in Petersburg, Riga, and Ukraine. She found a way around her own law in permitting their entry for colonization into New Russia, area between Crimea and Moldavia, which was still a wasteland, was originally secretly from Riga, and the nationality of the Jews was kept more or less a secret. Jews went there from Poland and Lithuania. In the first partition of Poland, 1772, Russia reacquired White Russia, Belarus, along with her 100,000 Jews. After the 11th century, more and more Jews came into Poland because princes and later kings encouraged all active, industrious people from Western Europe to settle there. Jews actually received special rights, e.g., in the 13th century from Boleslav the Pious, in 14th from Casimir the Great, and in 16th century from Sigismund I and Stefan Bathany, though this sometimes alternated with repression, e.g. in the 15th century by Vladislav Jagiello and Alexander, son of Casimir. There were 2 pogroms in Krakow. In 16th century, several ghettos were constructed partly to protect them. The Roman Catholic spirituals were the most continuous source of a hostile stance. Nevertheless, on balance, it must have been a favorable environment, since in the first half of the 16th century, the Jewish population increased substantially. There was a big role for Jews in the business activity of landlords, in that they became leasers of the brandy distilling operations. After the Tatar devastation, Kiev in the 14th century came under Lithuania and/or Poland, and in this arrangement, more and more Jews wandered from Podolia and Volhynia into the Ukraine, in the regions of Kiev, Poltava, and Chernigov. This process accelerated when a large part of Ukraine came directly under Poland in the Union of Lublin, 1569. The main population consisted of Orthodox peasants, who for a long time had had special rights and were free of tolls. Now began an intensive colonization of the Ukraine by the Polish Szlachta, Polish nobility, in conjoint action by the Jews. The Cossacks were forced into immobility and obligated to perform drudgery and pay taxes. The Catholic lords burdened the Orthodox peasants with various taxes and service duties, and in this exploitation, the Jews also partly played a sad role. They leased from the lords the propination, i.e., the right to distill vodka and sell it, as well as other trades. The Jewish leasers, who represented the Polish lord, received, of course, only to a certain degree, that power that the landholder had over the peasants. And since the Jewish leasers strove to wring from the peasants a maximum profit, the rage of the peasants rose not only against the Catholic landlords, but also against the Jewish leasers. When from this situation, a bloody uprising of the Cossacks arose in 1648 under leadership of Chmielnicki, Jews as well as Poles were the victims. 10,000 Jews died. The Jews were lured in by the natural riches of the Ukraine and by Polish magnates that were colonizing the land, and thus assumed an important economic role. Since they served the interest of the landlords and the regime, the Jews brought on themselves the hatred of the residents. N.I. Kostomarov adds that the Jews leased not only various branches of the privileged industries, but even the Orthodox churches, gaining the right to levy a fee for baptisms. After the uprising, the Jews, on the basis of the Treaty of Belaya-Surkov in 1651, were again given the right to resettle in the Ukraine. The Jews were, like before, resident and leaser of the royal industries, and the industries of the Szlachta, and so it was to remain. Going into the 18th century, brandy distilling was practically the main profession of Jews. This trade often led to conflicts with the peasants, who sometimes were drawn into the taverns, not so much because well-to-do, but on account of their poverty and misery. Included among the restrictions placed on the Polish Jews in response to demands of the Catholic Church was the prohibition against Jews having Christian house servants. Because of the recruitment coupled with the state tax increases in neighboring Russia, not a few refugees came to Poland, where they had no rights. In the debates of Catherine's Commission for reworking a new law code, 1767 to 1768, one could hear that in Poland, already a number of Russian refugees are servants to Jews. The Kahal and civil rights. The Jews of Poland maintained a vigorous economic relation to the surrounding population, yet in the 5 centuries that they lived there, did not permit any influence from outside themselves. 1 century after another rolled by in post-medieval European development, while the Polish Jews remained confined to themselves and were always an anachronistic appearance. They had a fixed order within themselves. Here it is granted that these conditions, which later remained intact also in Russia until the middle of the 19th century, were favorable for the religious and national preservation of the Jews from the very beginning of their diaspora. The whole Jewish life was guided by the Kahal, which had developed from the communal life of the Jews and the rabbis. The Kahal, or plural version, the Kahilat, was the autonomous organization of the leadership of the Jewish congregations in Poland. Solzhenitsyn relates that the Kahal was a buffer between Polish authorities and Jewish people, collected the taxes, for example. They took care of the needy and also regulated Jewish commerce, approved resales, purchases, and leases, adjudicated disputes between Jews, which could not be appealed to the secular legal system without incurring the ban. What may have started as a democratic institution took on the qualities of an oligarchy, bent on maintaining its own power. In turn, the rabbis and Kahal had a mutually exploitative relation, in that the rabbis were the executive enforcement arm of the Kahal, and the rabbis owed their position to appointment by the Kahal. Likewise, the Kahal owed the maintenance of its power more to the secular regime than to its own people. Toward the end of the 17th century and through the 18th century, the country was torn by strife. The magnates' arbitrariness increased further. Jews became poor and demoralized and hardened in early middle-aged forms of life. They became childlike or better, childish oldsters. 16th century Jewish spiritual rulers were concentrated in Germany and Polish Jewry. They put barriers up against contact with outsiders. The rabbinates held the Jews in firm bondage to the past. The fact that the Jewish people have held themselves together in their diaspora for 2,000 years inspires wonder and admiration. But when one examines certain periods more closely, as example given, the Polish-Russian one in the 16th and into the middle of the 17th century, and how this unity was only won by means of methods of suppression exercised by the Kahilat, then no one longer knows if it can be evaluated merely as an aspect of religious tradition. If the slightest trace of such isolationism were detected amongst us Russians, we would be severely faulted. When Jewry came under the rule of the Russian state, this indigenous system remained, in which the hierarchy of the Kahal had a self-interest. According to J.I. Gessen, all the anger that enlightened Jews felt against the ossifying Talmudic tradition became stronger in the middle of the 19th century. The representatives of the ruling class of Jewry staked everything on persuading the Russian administration of the necessity to maintain this centuries-old institution, which reflected the interest both of the Russian power and of the ruling Jewish class. The Kahal, in connection with the rabbis, held all the power and not seldom abused it. It misappropriated public funds, trampled the rights of the poor, arbitrarily increased taxes, and wreaked vengeance on personal enemies. At the end of the 18th century, the governor of one of the administrative regions attached to Russia wrote in his report, "The rabbis, the spiritual council, and the Kahal, which are knitted closely together, hold all things in their hand, and lord it over the conscience of the Jews, and in complete isolation rule over them, without any relation to the civil order." In the 18th century Eastern European Jewry, two movements developed, the religious one of the Hasidim, or Chassidim, and the enlightening one favoring secular culture, spearheaded by Moses Mendelssohn. But the Kehiloth suppressed both with all its might. In 1781, the rabbinate of Lithuanian Vilna placed the ban over the Hasidim, and in 1784, the Assembly of Rabbis in White Russian, Mogilev, declared them as outlaws and their property as without owner. Thereafter, mobs laid waste to the houses of Hasidim in several cities, i.e., it was an intra-Jewish pogrom. The Hasidim were persecuted in the most cruel and unfair manner. Their rivals did not even feel embarrassed to denounce them before the Russian authorities with false political charges. In turn, the officials in 1799, based on complaint of Hasidics, arrested members of the Kehilat of Vilna for embezzlement of tax money. The Hasidim movement expanded, being especially successful in certain provinces. The rabbis had Hasidic books publicly burned, and the Hasidim emerged as defenders of the people against abuses of the Kehilat. It is apparent that in those times, the religious war overshadowed other questions of religious life. The part of White Russia that fell to Russia in 1772 consisted of the provinces of Polotsk, later Vitebsk, and Mogilev. In a communique to those governments in the name of Catherine, it was explained that the residents, of whichever sex and standing they might be, would from now on have the right to public exercise of faith and to own property, in addition to all rights, freedoms, and privileges which their subjects previously enjoyed. The Jews were thus legally set as equals to Christians, which had not been the case in Poland. As to the Jews, it was added that their business stay and remain intact with all those rights that they had today enjoy, i.e., nothing would be taken away from Polish rights either. Through this, the previous power of the Kehilat survived. The Jews, with their Kahal system, remained isolated from the rest of the population and were not immediately taken into the class of traders and businessmen that corresponded to their predominant occupations. In the beginning, Catherine was on her guard, not only against any hostile reaction of Polish nobility, from whom power threatened to slip away, but also against giving an unfavorable impression to her Orthodox subjects. She did extend wider rights to the Jews, whom she wished well, and promised herself of their economic utility to the nation. Already in 1778, the most recent general Russian regulation was extended to White Russia. Those holding up to 500 rubles belonged to the class of trade-plying townsmen. Those with more capital to the class of merchant, endowed into one of 3 guilds according to possession. Both classes were free of the poll tax and paid 1% of their capital, which was declared according to conscience. This regulation was of particularly great significance. It set aside the national isolation of Jews up to that time. Catherine wanted to end that. Further, she subverted the traditional Polish perspective on Jews as an element standing outside the state. Moreover, she weakened the Kahal system, the capability of the Kahal to compel. The process began of pressing Jews into the civil organism, The Jews availed themselves to a great extent of the right to be registered as merchants, so that, example given, 10% of the Jewish population in the Mogilev province declared themselves as merchants, but only 5.5% of the Christians. The Jewish merchants were now freed from the tax obligation to the Kahal, and did not have to apply to the Kahal anymore for permission to be temporarily absent. They had only to deal with the cognizant magistrate. In 1780, the Jews in Mogilev and Shklov greeted Catherine upon her arrival with odes. With this advance of Jewish merchants, the civil category Jew ceased to exist. All other Jews had now likewise to be assigned to a status, and obviously the only one left for them was townsmen. But at first, few wanted to be reclassified as such, since the annual poll tax for townsmen at that time was 60 kopecks, but only 50 kopecks for Jews. However, there was no other option. From 1783, neither the Jewish townsmen nor merchants needed to pay their taxes to the Kahal, but instead to the magistrate, each according to his class, and from him they also received their travel passes. The new order had consequences for the cities, which only took status into consideration, not nationality. According to this arrangement, all townsmen, thus also all Jews, had the right to participate in the local class governance and occupy official posts. Corresponding to the conditions of that time, this meant that the Jews became citizens with equal rights. The entry of Jews as citizens with equal right into the merchant guilds and townsman class was an event of great social significance. It was supposed to transform the Jews into an economic power that would have to be reckoned with and raise their morale. It also made the practical protection of their life interests easier. At that time, the classes of traders and tradesmen, just like the municipal commonwealth, had a broad self-determination. Thus, a certain administrative and judicial power was placed into the hands of Jews, just like Christians, through which the Jewish population held a commercial and civil influence and significance. Jews could not only become mayors, but also advisory delegates and judges. At first, limitations were enacted in the larger cities to ensure that no more Jews occupied electable positions than Christians. In 1786, however, Catherine sent to the Governor-General of White Russia a command written by her own hand to actualize the equality of Jews in the municipal class self-governance, unconditionally and without any hesitation, and to impose an appropriate penalty upon anyone that should hinder this equality. It should be pointed out that the Jews thus were given equal rights not only in contrast to Poland, but also earlier than in France or the German states. Under Frederick the Great, the Jews suffered great limitations. Indeed, the Jews in Russia had from the beginning the personal freedom that the Russian peasants were only granted 80 years later. Paradoxically, the Jews gained greater freedom than even the Russian merchants and tradesmen. The latter had to live exclusively in the cities, while in contrast the Jewish population could live in colonizations in the country and distill liquor. Although the Jews dwelled in clusters, not only in the city but also in the villages, they were accounted as part of the city contingent, inclusive of merchant and townsman classes. According to the manner of their activity and surrounded by unfree peasantry, they played an important economic role. Rural trade was concentrated in their hands, and they leased various posts belonging to the landowner's privilege, specifically the sale of vodka in taverns, and therewith fostered the expansion of drunkenness. The White Russian powers reported, "The presence of the Jews in the villages acts with harm upon the economic and moral condition of the rural population, because the Jews encourage drunkenness among the local population." In the stance taken by the powers that be, it was indicated among other things that the Jews led the peasants astray with drunkenness, idleness, and poverty, that they had given them vodka on credit, etc. But the brandy operations were an attractive source of income for both the Polish landowners and the Jewish commissioners. Granted, the gift of citizenship that the Jews received brought a danger with it. Obviously, the Jews were also supposed to acquiesce to the general rule to cease the brandy business in the villages and move out. In 1783, the following was published. The general rule requires every citizen to apply himself in a respectable trade and business, but not the distilling of schnapps, as that is not a fitting business. And whenever the proprietor permits the merchant, townsman, or Jew to distill vodka, he will be held as a lawbreaker. And thus it happened. They began to transfer the Jews from the villages to the cities to deflect them from their centuries-old occupation, the leasing of distilleries and taverns. Naturally, to the Jews, the threat of a complete removal from the villages naturally appeared not as a uniform civil measure, but rather as one that was set up specially to oppose their national religion. The Jewish townsmen that were supposed to be resettled into the city and unambiguously were to be robbed of a very lucrative business in the country fell into an inner city and inner Jewish competition. Indignation grew among the Jews, and in 1784, a commission of the Kahilot traveled to St. Petersburg to seek the cancellation of these measures. At the same time, the Kahilot reasoned that they should, with the help of the administration, regain their lost power in its full extent over the Jewish population. But the answer of the Caesarina read, "As soon as the people yoked to the Jewish law have arrived at the condition of equality, the order must be upheld in every case, so that each, according to his rank and status, enjoys the benefits and rights, without distinction of belief or national origin." But the clenched power of the Polish proprietors also had to be reckoned with. Although the administration of White Russia forbade them in 1783 to lease the schnapps distilling to unauthorized persons, especially Jews, the landlords continued to lease this industry to the Jews. That was their right, an inheritance of centuries-old Polish custom. The Senate did not venture to apply force against the landholders, and in 1786 removed their jurisdiction to relocate Jews into cities. For this, a compromise was found. The Jews would be regarded as people that had relocated to the cities, but would retain the right to temporary visits to the villages. That meant that those that were living in the villages continued to live there. The Senate permission of 1786 permitted the Jews to live in villages, and Jews were allowed to lease from the landlords the right to produce and sell alcoholic beverages, while Christian merchants and townsmen did not obtain these rights. Even the efforts of the delegation of Kahilot in St. Petersburg was not wholly without success. They did not get what they came for, the establishment of a separate Jewish court for all contentions between Jews. But in 1786, a significant part of their supervisory right was given back. The supervision of Jewish townsmen, i.e., the majority of the Jewish population. This included not only the division of public benefits, but also the levying of poll tax and adjudicating the right to separate from the congregation. Thus, the administration recognized its interest in not weakening the power of the Kahal. In all Russia, the status of traders and businessmen, merchants and townsmen, did not have the right to choose their residences. Their members were bound to that locality in which they were registered, in order that the financial position of their localities would not be weakened. However, the Senate made an exception in 1782 for White Russia. The merchants could move, as the case might be, as it was propitious for commerce, from one city to another. The ruling favored especially the Jewish merchants. However, they began to exploit this right in a greater extent than had been foreseen. Jewish merchants began to be registered in Moscow and Smolensk. Jews began soon after the annexation of White Russia in 1882 to settle in Moscow. By the end of the 18th century, the number of Jews in Moscow was considerable. Some Jews that had entered the ranks of the Moscow merchant class began to practice wholesaling. Other Jews, in contrast, sold foreign goods from their apartments or in the courts, or began peddling, though this was at the time forbidden. In 1790, the Moscow merchants submitted a complaint. In Moscow has emerged a not insignificant number of Jews from foreign countries and from White Russian, who, as opportunity afforded, joined the Moscow merchants' guilds, and then utilized forbidden methods of business, which brought about very hurtful damage, and the cheapness of their goods indicated that it involved smuggling, but moreover, as is well known, they cut coins. It is possible that they will also do this in Moscow. As amends to their thoroughly cagey findings, the Moscow merchants demanded their removal from Moscow. The Jewish merchants appealed with a counter-complaint that they were not accepted into the Smolensk and Moscow merchant guilds. The Council of Her Majesty heard the complaints. In accordance with the unified Russian order, she firmly established that Jews did not have the right to be registered in the Russian trading towns and harbors, but only in White Russia. By no means is usefulness to be expected from the migration of Jews into Moscow. In December 1791, she promulgated a highest order ukase which prohibited Jews to join the merchant guilds of the inner provinces, but permitted them for a limited time, for trade reasons, to enter Moscow. Jews were allowed to utilize the rights of the merchant guild and townsman class only in White Russia. The right to permanent residency and membership in the townsman class, Catherine continued, was granted in New Russia, now accessible in the viceregencies of Yekaterinoslav, glory of Catherine the Great, and Taurida. Shortly thereafter, these became the provinces of Yekaterinoslav, Taurida, and Cherson. That is, Catherine allowed Jews to migrate into the new expansive territories into which Christian merchants and townsmen from the provinces of the interior of Russia generally were not permitted to emigrate. When in 1796 it was made known that groups of Jews already had immigrated into Kiev, Chernigov, and Novgorod-Siversk provinces, it was likewise granted there to utilize the rights of the merchant guild and the townsman class. The pre-revolution Jewish Encyclopedia writes, the Ukase of 1791 laid the groundwork for setting up the Pale of Settlement, even if it wasn't so intended. Under the conditions of the then obtaining social and civic order in general, and of Jewish life in particular, the administration could not consider bringing about a particularly onerous situation, and conclude for them exceptional laws, which, among other things, would restrict the right of residency. In the context of its time, this ukase did not contain that which in this respect would have brought the Jews into a less favorable condition than the Christians. The ukase of 1791 in no way limited the rights of Jews in the choice of residency, created no special borders, and for Jews, the way was opened into new regions, into which, in general, people could not emigrate. The main point of the decree was not concerned with their Jewishness, but that they were traders. The question was not considered from the national or religious point of view, but only from the viewpoint of usefulness. This ukase of 1791, which actually privileged Jewish merchants in comparison to Christian ones, was in the course of its time the basis for the future Pale of Settlement, which almost until the Revolution cast, as it were, a dark shadow over Russia. By itself, however, the ukase of 1791 was not so oppressive in its outworking as to prevent a small Jewish colony from emerging in St. Petersburg by the end of the reign of Catherine II. Here lived the famous tax leaser Abram Peretz and some of the merchants close to him, and also, while the religious struggle was in full swing, the Rabbi Avigdor Chaimovich and his opponent, the famous Hasidic Tzaddik, Zalman Borichovich. In 1793 and 1795, the second and third partition of Poland took place, and the Jewish population from Lithuania, Podolia, and Volhynia, numbering almost 1 million, came under Russia's jurisdiction. This increase in population was a very significant event, though for a long time not recognized as such. It later influenced the fate of both Russia and the Jewry of East Europe. After centuries-long wandering, Jewry came under one roof, in a single great congregation. In the now vastly expanded region of Jewish settlement, the same questions came up as before. The Jews obtained rights of merchant guild and townsmen, which they had not possessed in Poland, and they had got the right to equal participation in the class municipal self-government, then had to accept the restrictions of this status. They could not migrate into the cities of the inner Russian provinces, and were liable to be moved out of the villages. With the now huge extent of the Jewish population, the Russian regime no longer had a way to veil the fact that the Jews continued to live in the villages simply by modeling it as a temporary visit. A burning question was whether the economic condition could tolerate so many tradesmen and traders living amongst the peasants. In order to diffuse the problem, many shtetl were made equal to cities. Thus, the legal possibility came about for Jews to continue living there. But with the large number of Jews in the country and the high population density in the cities, that was no solution. Now, it seemed to be a natural way out that the Jews would take advantage of the possibility offered by Catherine to settle in the huge, scarcely occupied New Russia. The new settlers were offered inducements, but this did not succeed in setting a colonization movement into motion. Even the freedom of the new settlers from taxes appeared not to be attractive enough to induce such a migration. Thus, Catherine decided in 1794 to induce the Jews to immigrate with contrary measures. The Jews were not relocated out of the villages. At the same time, she decided to assess the entire Jewish population with a tax that was double that paid by the Christians. Such a tax had already been paid for a long time by the old believers. But applied to the Jews, this law proved to be neither effective nor of long duration. Those were the last regulations of Catherine. From the end of 1796, Paul I reigned. The Jewish Encyclopedia evaluates him in this way. The time of the angry rule of Paul I passed well for the Jews. All the edicts of Paul I concerning the Jews indicate that the monarch was tolerant and benevolent toward the Jewish population. When the interest of Jews conflicted with Christians, Paul I by no means automatically sided with the Christian. Even in 1791, he ordered measures to reduce the power of the Jews and the spirituals over the peasants. That was actually not set up against the Jews. The point was the protection of the peasants. Paul also recognized the right of the Hasidim not to have to live in secrecy. He extended the right of the Jews to belong to the merchant and townsman class, even to the Courland province, which was no Polish inheritance, and later it also did not belong to the Pale of Settlement. Consistent with that policy, he denied the respective petitions of the parishes of Kovno, Kamenez, Podolsk, Kiev, and Vilna to be permitted to move the Jews out of their cities. Paul had inherited the stubborn resistance of the Polish landholders against any changing of their rights. Among these was the right over the Jews and the right to hold court over them. They misuse these rights often. Thus, the complaint of the Jews of Berdichev, Ukraine, against the princes of Radziwill, stated, "In order to hold our religious services, we must first pay gold to those to whom the prince has leased our faith." And against Catherine's former favorite, Simon or Zorich, "One ought not to have to pay him for the air one breathes." In Poland, many shtetl and cities were the possession of nobles, and the landowners assessed arbitrary and opportunistic levies that the residents had to pay. Dzerzhavin and the Belarus famine. Since the start of the reign of Paul I, there was a great famine in White Russia, especially in the province of Minsk. The poet Gavrila Romanovich Dzerzhavin, then serving as senator, was commissioned to go there and determine its cause and seek a solution, for which the task he received no money to buy grain, but instead had the right to confiscate possessions of negligent landowners, sell their stockpile, and distribute them. Dzerzhavin was not just a great poet, but also an outstanding statesman who left behind unique proofs of his effectiveness, which we want to delve into in the following. The famine, as Dzerzhavin confirmed, was unimaginable. He writes, "When I arrived in White Russia, I personally convinced myself out of the greatest scarcity of grain among the villages. Due to the very serious hunger, virtually all nourished themselves from fermented grass mixed with a tiny portion of meal or pearl barley. The peasants were malnourished and sallow like dead people. In order to remedy this, I found out which of the rich landowners had grain in their storehouses, took it to the town center, and distributed it to the poor. And I commanded the goods of a Polish count, in view of such pitiless greed, to be yielded to a trustee. After the nobleman was made aware of the dire situation, he awoke from his slumber, or better, from his shocking indifference toward humanity. He used every means to feed the peasants by acquiring grain from neighboring provinces, and when after 2 months the harvest time had arrived, the famine had ended." When Dzerzhavin visited the provincial government, he so pursued the noble rulers and district police captains that the nobility banded together and sent the Czar a scurrilous complaint against Dzerzhavin. Dzerzhavin discovered that the Jewish schnapps distillers exploited the alcoholism of the peasants. "After I had discovered that the Jews, from profit-seeking use the lure of drink to beguile grain from the peasants, convert it into brandy and therewith cause a famine, I commanded that they should close their distillery in the village Liosono. I informed myself from sensible inhabitants, as well as nobles, merchants, and villagers, about the manner of the life of the Jews, their occupations, their deceptions, and all of their pettifogging with which they provide the poor dumb villages with hunger, and on the other hand, by what means one could protect them from the common pack, and how to facilitate for them an honorable and respectable way out, to enable them to become useful citizens." Afterwards, in the autumn months, Dzerzhavin described many evil practices of the Polish landlords and Jewish leasers in his Memorandum on the Mitigation of Famine in White Russia and on the Lifestyles of the Jews, which he also made known to the Czar and the highest officials of state. This memorandum is a very comprehensive document that evaluates the conditions inherited from the Poles, as well as the possibilities for overcoming the poverty of the peasants, describing the peculiarities of the Jewish way of life of that time, and includes a proposal for reform in comparison to Prussia and Austria. The very explicit practical presentation of the recommended measures makes this the first work of an enlightened Russian citizen concerning Jewish life in Russia, in those first years in which Russia acquired Jews in a large mass. That makes it a work of special interest. The memorandum consists of two parts. 1. On the residents of White Russian in general. In reviews of the memorandum, we usually find no mention of this important part. And 2. On the Jews. Number 1. Derzhavin begins by establishing that the agricultural economy was in shambles. The peasants there were lazy on the job, not clever. They procrastinate every small task and are sluggish in their field work. Year in, year out, they eat unwinnowed corn. In the spring, kolutucha, or bolotucha, from eggs and rye meal. In summer, they content themselves with a mixture of small amount of some grain, or other with chopped and cooked grass. They are so weakened that they stagger around. The local Polish landlords are not good proprietors. They do not manage the property themselves, but lease it out, a Polish custom. But for the lease, there are no universal rules protecting the peasants from overbearing or to keep the business aspect from falling apart. Many greedy leasers, by imposing hard work and oppressive taxes, bring the people into a bad way and transform them into poor, homeless peasants. This lease is all the worst for being short-term, made for 1 to 3 years at a time, so that the leaser hastens to get his advantage from it, without regard to the exhausting of the estate. The emaciation of the peasants was sometimes even worse. Several landlords that lease the traffic in spirits in their villages to the Jews sign stipulations that the peasants may only buy their necessities from these leasers, triple price. Likewise, the peasants may not sell their product to anyone except the Jewish leaseholder, cheaper than the market price. Thus, they plunge the villagers into misery, and especially when they distribute again their hoarded grain, they must finally give a double portion. Whoever does not do it is punished. The villagers are robbed of every possibility to prosper and be full. Then, he develops in more detail the problem of the liquor distilling. Schnapps was distilled by the landlords, the landed nobility, Sazalakta, of the region, the priests, monks, and Jews. Of the almost 1,000,000 Jews, 2,000 to 3,000 live in the villages, and live mainly from the liquor traffic. The peasants, after bringing in the harvest, are sweaty and careless in what they spend. They drink, eat, enjoy themselves, pay the Jews for their old debts, and then, whatever, they ask for drinks. For this reason, the shortage is almost manifest by winter. In every settlement, there is at least one, and in several settlements, quite a few taverns built by the landlords, where for their advantage, and that of the Jewish leaseholders, liquor is sold day and night. There, the Jews trick them out of not only the life-sustaining grain, but that which is sown in the field implements, household items, health, and even their life. And all that is sharpened by the Morris of the Kolida. Jews travel especially during the harvest and autumn through the villages, and after they have made the farmer, along with his whole family, drunk, drive them into debt, and take from them every last thing needed to survive, in that they box the drunkard's ears and plunder him. The villager is plunged into the deepest misery. He lists also other reasons for the impoverishing of the peasants. Doubtless, behind these fateful distilleries stand the Polish landlords. Proprietor and leaser act in behalf of the owner and attend to making a profit. To this class, Gesson asserts, belong not just Jews, but also Christians, especially priests. But the Jews were an irreplaceable, active, and very inventive link in the chain of exploitation of these illiterate, emaciated peasants that had no rights of their own. If the White Russian settlement had not been injected with Jewish tavern managers and leasers, then the widespread system of exploitation would not have functioned, and removing the Jewish links in the chain would have ended it. After this, Derzhaven recommended energetic measures, as for example, the expurgation of these burdens of peasant life. The landlords would need to attend to this problem. Only they alone who are responsible for the peasants should be allowed to distill liquor under their own supervision, and not from far removed places, and to see to it that every year a supply of grain for themselves and the peasants would be on hand, and indeed as much as would be needed for good nutrition. If the danger arises that this is not done, then the property is to be confiscated for the state coffers. The schnapps distilling is to begin no sooner than the middle of September, and the end middle of April, i.e., the whole time of land cultivation is to be free of liquor consumption. In addition, the liquor is not to be sold during worship services or at night. The liquor stores should only be permitted in the main streets near the market, mills, and establishments where foreigners gather. But all the superfluous and newly built liquor stores, whose number has greatly increased since the annexation of White Russia, are immediately to cease use for that purpose, the sale of liquor in them to be forbidden. In villages and out-of-the-way places, there should not be any that the peasant not sink into drunkenness. Jews, however, should not be permitted to sell liquor either by the glass or the keg, nor should they be the brewmasters in the distilleries, and they should not be allowed to lease the liquor stores. Colletas are also to be forbidden, as well as the short-term leasing of operations. By means of exacting stipulations, the leaser is to be prevented from working an operation into the ground. Under threat of punishment is market abuse to be forbidden, by which the landlords do not permit their peasants to buy what they need somewhere else, or to sell their surplus somewhere other than to their proprietor. There were still other economic proposals. In this manner, the scarcity of food can in the future be prevented in the White Russian province. Number 2. In the second part of the memorandum, Derzhaven, going out from the task given by the Senate, submitted a suggestion for the transformation of the life of the Jews in the Russian kingdom, not in isolation, but rather in the context of the misery of White Russia, and with the goal to improve the situation. But here, he set himself the assignment to give a brief overview of Jewish history, especially the Polish period, in order to explain the current customs of the Jews. Among others, he used his conversations with the Berlin-educated enlightened Jew, physician Ilya Frank, who put his thoughts down in writing. The Jewish popular teachers mingle mystic Talmudic pseudo-exegesis of the Bible with the true spirit of the teachings. They expound strict laws with the goal of isolating the Jews from other peoples and to instill a deep hatred against every other religion. Instead of cultivating a universal virtue, they contrive an empty ceremony of honoring God. The moral character of the Jews has changed in the last century to their disadvantage, and in consequence, they have become pernicious subjects. In order to renew the Jews morally and politically, they have to be brought to the point of returning to the original purity of their religion. The Jewish reform in Russia must begin with the foundation of public schools, in which the Russian, German, and Jewish languages would be taught. What kind of prejudice is it to believe that the assimilation of secular knowledge is tantamount to a betrayal of religion and folk, and that working the land is not suitable for a Jew? Derzhaven declined in his memorandum a suggestion by Nota Chaimovich Notkin, a major merchant from Shklov, whom he had also met, although Notkin demurred from the most important conclusions and suggestions of Derzhaven that had to do with Jews. He was at the same time in favor, if possible, of excluding the Jews from the production of liquor, and saw it as needful for them to get an education and pursue a productive career, preferably working with their hands, whereby he also held out the possibility of emigration into the fruitful steppe for the purpose of raising sheep and crops. Following the explanation of Frank, who rejected the power of the Kahilites, Derzhavin proceeded from the same general consequences. The original principles of pure worship and ethics of the Jews had been transformed into false concepts, by which the simple Jewish people is misled, and constantly is so led. So much so that between them and those of other faiths a wall has been built that cannot be broken through, which has been made firm, a wall that firmly binds the Jews together, and, surrounded by darkness, separates them from their fellow citizens. Thus, in raising their children, they pay plenty for Talmud instructions, and that without time limit. As long as the students continue in their current conditions, there is no prospect for a change in their ways. They believe themselves to be the true worshippers of God, and despise everyone of a different faith. There, the people are brought to a constant expectation of the Messiah. They believe that their Messiah, by overthrowing all earthlings, will rule over them in the flesh and blood and restore to them their former kingdom, fame, and glory. Of the youths, he wrote, they marry all too young, sometimes before they reach 10 years old, and though nubile, they are not strong enough. Regarding the Kahal system, the inner Jewish collection of levies provides to the Kahilit every year an enviable sum of income that is incomparably higher than the state taxes that are raised from individuals in the census lists. The Kahal elders do not excuse anyone from the accounting. As a result, their poor masses find themselves in a condition of severe emaciation and great poverty, and there are many of them. In contrast, the members of the Kahal are rich and live superfluity by ruling over both levers of power, the spiritual and secular. They have a great power over the people. In this way, they hold them in great poverty and fear. The Kahilit issues to the people every possible command, which must be performed with such exactitude and speed that one can only wonder. Derzhavin identified the nub of the problem thusly. The Jews, great numbers in White Russia, is itself a heavy burden for the land on account of the disproportion to that of the crop farmers. This disproportion is the outstanding one of several important reasons that produces here a shortage of grain and other edible stores. Not one of them was a crop farmer at that time, yet each possessed and gobbled up more grain than the peasant with his large family, who had harvested it by the sweat of his brow. Above all, in the villages they are occupied in giving the peasant all their necessities on credit, at extraordinary rate of interest, and thus the peasant, who at some time or other became a debtor to them, can no longer get free of it. Arching over this are the frivolous landlords that put their villages into Jewish hands, not just temporarily, but permanently. The landowners, however, are happy to be able to shift everything onto the Jews. According to their own words, they regard the Jews as the sole reason for the wasting of the peasants, and the landlord only rarely acknowledges that he, if they were removed from his holdings, would suffer no small loss, since he deceives from them no small income from the lease. Thus, Derzhavin did not neglect to examine the matter from a variety of angles. In fairness to the Jews, we must point out also that during this grain shortage, they have taken care to feed not a few hungry villagers, though everyone also knows that that came with a bill. Upon the harvest being brought in, they will get it back 100-fold. In a private report to the Attorney General, Derzhavin wrote, It is hard not to err by putting all the blame on one side. The peasants booze away their grain with the Jews and suffer under its shortage. The landholders cannot forbid drunkenness, for they owe almost all their income to the distilling of liquor, and all the blame cannot be placed even on the Jews, that they take the last morsel of bread away from the peasant to earn their own life sustenance. To Ilya Frank, Derzhavin once said, "Since the providence of this tiny scattered people has preserved them until the present, we too must take care for their protection." And in his report, he wrote with the uprightness of that time, "If the Most High Providence, to the end of some unknown purpose, leaves, on account of his purposes, this dangerous people to live on the earth, then governments under whose scepter they have sought protection must bear it. They are thus obligated extend their protection to the Jews, so that they may be useful both to themselves and to the society in which they dwell." Because of all his observations in White Russia, and of his conclusion, and of all he wrote in the memorandum, and especially because of all these lines, and probably also because he praised the keen vision of the great Russian monarchs, which forbade the immigration and travel of these clever robbers into their realm, is Derzhavin spoken of as a fanatical enemy of Jews, a great anti-Semite. He is accused, though unjustly, as we have seen, of imputing the drunkenness and poverty of the white Russian peasant exclusively to the Jews, and his positive measures were characterized as given without evidence to serve his personal ambition. But that he was in no wise prejudiced against the Jews is indicated in that 1. His whole memorandum emerged in 1800 in response to the actual misery and hunger of the peasants. 2. The goal was to do well by both the white Russian peasants and the Jews. 3. He distinguished them economically. And 4. His desire was to orient the Jews toward a real productive activity, of whom, as Catherine planned, a part first and foremost was supposed to have been relocated in territories that were not closed. As a critical difficulty, Derzhavin saw the instability and transientness of the Jewish population, of which scarcely 1/6 was included in the census. Without a special extraordinary effort, it is too difficult to count them accurately, because being in cities, shtetl manor courts, villages and taverns, they constantly move back and forth. They do not identify themselves as local residents, but as guests that are here from another district or colony. Moreover, they all look alike, and have the same name, and have no surname, and not only that, all wear the same black garments. One cannot distinguish them and misidentifies them when they are registered or identified, especially in connection with judicial complaints and investigations. Therein, the Kahilot takes care not to disclose the real number, in order not unduly to burden their wealthy with taxes for the number registered. Derzhavin sought, however, a comprehensive solution to reduce the number of Jews in the white Russian villages without causing damage to anyone, and thus to ease the feeding of the original residents. Yet at the same time, for those that should remain, to provide better and less degrading possibilities for earning their sustenance. In addition, he probed how to reduce their fanaticism and, without retreating in the slightest from the rule of toleration toward different religions, to lead them by a barely noticed way to enlightenment, and after expunging their hatred of people of other faiths, above all to bring them to give up their besetting intention of stealing foreign goods. The goal was to find a way to separate the freedom of religious conscience from freedom from punishment of evil deeds. Thereafter, he laid out by layers and explicitly the measures to be recommended, and in doing so, gave proof of his economic and statesmanlike competence. First, that the Jews should have no occasion for any kind of irritation, to send them into flight or even to murmur quietly, They are to be reassured of protection and favor by a manifest of the Caesar, in which should be strengthened the principle of tolerance toward their faith and the maintenance of the privileges granted by Catherine, only with one small change to the previous principles. But those that will not submit to these principles shall be given the freedom to emigrate, a demand that far exceeded, in point of freedom, the 20th century's Soviet Union. Immediately thereafter, it states, after a special time interval, after which all new credit is temporarily forbidden, all claims of debt between Jews and Christians to be ordered, documented, and cleared, in order to restore the earlier relation of trust so that in the future, not the slightest obstruction should be found for the transformation of the Jews to a different way of life. For the relocation into other districts, or in the old places, for the assignment of new life conditions. Free of debt, the Jews are thus made to be as soon as possible into free men for the reforms. From the vantage point of the publication of the manifest, are all dues assessed by Jews for the equalization of debt of poor people is to apply it to poor Jews, to deflect the payment of kahal debts, or for the furnishings for migrants. From the one group, no tax is to be levied for 3 years, from the other for 6 years, and instead, that money is to be dedicated for the setting up of factories and workplaces for these Jews. Landowners must abandon obligating Jews in their shtetls to set up factories, and instead begin on their estates to cultivate grain, in order that they may earn their bread with their own hands. But under no circumstance is liquor to be sold anywhere secretly or openly, or these landholders would themselves lose their rights to the production of liquor. It was also a non-negotiable to carry out a universal exact census of the population under responsibility of the Kahal elders, for those that had no property to declare as merchant or townsman. 2 new classes were to be created with smaller income. Village burghers and colonists, where the denotation krestainen, farmer, would not be used because of its similarity to the word Christian. The Jewish settlers would have to be regarded as free and not as serfs, but under no condition or pretext may they dare to take Christian, man, or maidservants. They may not own a single Christian peasant, nor to expand themselves into the domain of magistrates and town fathers, so that they not gain any special rights over Christians. After they have declared their wish to be enrolled in a particular status, then must the necessary number of young men be sent to Petersburg, Moscow, or Riga. One group to learn the keeping of merchant books, second to learn a trade, the third to attend schools for agriculture and land management. Meanwhile, some energetic and precise Jews should be selected as deputies for all these areas where land is designated for colonization. There follows a minutiae on the arrangements of the plans, surveying the land, housing construction, the order to release different groups of settlers, their rights in transit, the grace period in which they would remain tax-free. All these details that Der Zavin laid out so carefully we pass by. On the inner ordering of the Jewish congregation, in order to place the Jews under the secular authorities, just the same as everyone else, the Kahilat may not continue in any form. Together with the abolishment of the Kahilat, is likewise abolished all previous profiteering assessments, which the Kahilat raised from the Jewish people, and at the same time, the secular taxes are to be assessed as with the other subjects, i.e., not doubled, and the schools and synagogues must be protected by laws. The males may not marry younger than 17, nor the females than 15 years. Then, there is a section on education and enlightenment of the Jews. The Jewish schools to the 12th year, and thereafter the general schools, are to become more like those of other religions. Those, however, that have achieved distinction in the high sciences are to be received in the academies and universities as honorary associates, doctors, professors. But they are not to be taken into the rank of officers and staff officers, because although they may also be taken into the military service, they will, e.g., not take up arms against the enemy on a Saturday, which in fact often does happen. Presses for Jewish books are to be constructed. Along with synagogues are to be constructed Jewish hospitals, poorhouses, and orphanages. Thus, Derzhavin concluded quite self-consciously. Thus, this cross-grained, scattered people known as Jews, in this its sad condition, will observe an example of order, especially regarding enlightenment. This first point will bear fruit, if not today and immediately, definitely in the coming times, or at worst after several generations, in an unnoticed way. And then the Jews would become genuine subjects of the Russian throne. While Derzhavin was composing his memorandum, he also made it known what the Kahilot thought about it, and made it clear that he was by no means making himself their friend. In the official answers, the rejection was formulated cautiously. It stated, "The Jews are not competent for cultivating grain, nor accustomed to it, and their faith is an obstacle. They see no other possibilities than their current occupations which serve their sustenance, and they do not need such, but would like to remain in their current situation." The Kahilot saw, moreover, that the report entailed their own obsolescence, the end of their source of income, and so began quietly but stubbornly and tenaciously to work against Derzhavin's whole proposal. This opposition expressed itself, according to Derzhavin, by means of complaint filed by a Jewess from Liozno to the Czar, in which she alleged that in a liquor distillery, Derzhavin horrifically beat her with a club until she, being pregnant, gave birth to a dead infant. The Senate launched an investigation. Derzhavin answered, "As I was a quarter hour long in this factory, I not only did not strike any Jewess, but indeed I did not even see one." He sought a personal reception by the Czar. "Let me be in prison, but I will reveal the idiocy of the man that has made such claims. How can your Highness believe such a foolish and untrue complaint?" The Jew that had taken the lying complaint was condemned to 1 year in the penitentiary, but after 2 or 3 months, Derzhavin accomplished his being set free, this being now under the reign of Alexander I. Paul, murdered in May 1801, was unable to come to any resolution in connection with Derzhavin's memorandum. It led at the time to small practical results, as one could have expected, since Derzhavin lost his position in the change of court. Not until the end of 1802 was the Committee for the Assimilation of the Jews established to examine Derzhavin's memorandum and prepare corresponding recommendations. The committee consisted of 2 Polish magnates close to Alexander I, Prince Adam Jerzy Czartoryski and Count Graf Severin Potocki, as well as Count Valerian Subov. Derzhavin observed regarding all 3 that they too had great holdings in Poland, and would notice a significant loss of income if the Jews were to be removed, and that the private interest of the above-mentioned worthies would outweigh those of the state. Also, on the committee were Interior Minister Kochubey and the already mentioned Justice Minister, the first in Russian history, Derzhavin himself. Michael Speransky also worked with the committee. The committee was charged to invite Jewish delegates from the Kahiloth of every province, and these, mostly merchants of the First Guild, did come. Besides that, the committee members had the right to call enlightened and well-meaning Jews of their acquaintance. The already known Nota Notkin that had moved from White Russia to Moscow and then St. Petersburg, the Petersburg tax leaser Abram Peretz, who was a close friend of Speransky, Yehuda Leib Nevachovich, and Mendel Satanever, both friends of Peretz and others. Not all took part in the hearings, but they exercised a significant influence on the committee members. Worthy of mention, Abram Peretz's son Gregory was condemned in the Decembrist trial and exiled, probably only because he had discussed the Jewish question with Pavel or Pestel, but without suspecting anything of the Decembrist conspiracy, and because his grandson was the Russian Secretary of State, a very high position. Nevachovich, a humanist, but no cosmopolitan, who was deeply tied to Russian cultural life, then a rarity among Jews, published in Russian The Crying Voice of the Daughter of Judah in 1803, in which he urged Russian society to reflect on the restrictions of Jewish rights, and admonished the Russians to regard Jews as their countrymen, and thus that they should take the Jews among them into Russian society. The committee came to an overwhelmingly supported resolution. The Jews are to be guided into the general life and education, to steer them toward productive work. It should be made easier for them to become employed in trades and commerce. The constriction of the right of free mobility should be lessened. They must become accustomed to wearing ordinary appeal, for the custom of wearing clothes that are despised strengthens the custom to be despised. But the most acute problem was that Jews, on account of the liquor trade, dwelled in the villages. Notkin strove to win the committee to the view of letting the Jews continue to live there, and only to take measures against possible abuses on their part. The charter of the committee led to tumult in the Kehiloth, Gessen wrote. A special convocation of their deputies in 1803 in Minsk resolved to petition our Caesar, may his fame become still greater, that they, the worthies, assume no innovations for us. They decided to send certain delegates to Petersburg, explained that an assembly had been held for that purpose, and even called for a 3-day Jewish fast. Unrest gripped the whole Pale of settlement, quite apart from the threatening expulsion of Jews from the villages. The Kehiloth took a negative stance toward the cultural question, out of concern to preserve their own way of life. As an answer to the main points of the recommendation, the Kehiloth explained that the reform must in any case be postponed 15 to 20 years. Derzhavin wrote, there were, from their side, various rebuttals aimed to leave everything as it was. In addition, Gurko, a white Russian landowner, sent Derzhavin a letter he had received. A Jew in White Russia had written him regarding one of his plenipotentiaries in Petersburg. It said that they had, in the name of all Kehilot of the world, put the cherem, or harem, i.e. the ban, on Derzhavin as a persecutor, and had gathered 1 million to be used as gifts for this situation, and had forwarded it to St. Petersburg. They appealed for all efforts to be applied to the removal of Derzhavin as Attorney General, and, if that were not possible, to seek his life. However, the thing they wanted to achieve was not to be forbidden to sell liquor in the village taverns, and in order to make it easier to advance this business, they would put together opinions from foreign regions, from different places and peoples, on how the situation of the Jews could be improved. And in fact, such opinions, sometimes in French, sometimes in German, began to be sent to the committee. Besides this, Nota Notkin became the central figure that organized the little Jewish congregation of Petersburg. In 1803, he submitted a brief to the committee in which he sought to paralyze the effect of the proposal submitted by Derzhavin. Derzhavin writes, Notkin came to him one day and asked him, with feigned well-wishing, that he, Derzhavin, should not take a stand all alone against his colleagues on the committee, who are all on the side of the Jews, whether he would not accept 100, or if that is too little, 200,000 rubles, only so that he could be of one mind with all his colleagues on the committee. Derzhavin decided to disclose this attempt at bribery to the Czar to prove it to him with Gurko's letter. He thought such strong proofs prove effective, and the Czar would start to be wary of the people that surrounded him and protected the Jews. Speransky also informed the Czar of it, but Speransky was fully committed to the Jews, and from the first meeting of the Jewish Committee, it became apparent that all members represented the view that the liquor distilling should continue in the hands of the Jews as before. Derzhavin opposed it. Alexander bore himself ever more coldly toward him, and dismissed his justice minister shortly thereafter in 1803. Beside this, Derzhavin's papers indicate that he, whether in military or civil service, always came into disfavor, and was hot-headed and everywhere soon took his leave. One has to admit that Derzhavin foresaw much that developed in the problematic Russo-Judaic relationship throughout the entire 19th century, even if not in the exact and unexpected form that it took in the event. He expressed himself coarsely, as was customary then, but he did not intend to oppress the Jews. On the contrary, he wanted to open the Jews' paths to a more free and productive life. End of chapter 1.